Thank you, Richard. The purpose of my speech today is to describe the outlook for Australian horticulture to 2016-17. Now, this is a very diverse industry, so in the time available I can present not much more than an overview. There's more detail in the accompanying paper. A little background is necessary before I discuss the outlook for the industry to 2016-17 and the key challenges to be faced by the industry over this period. The Australian horticulture industry, excluding wine grapes, accounted for an estimated 18% of the gross value of Australian agriculture in 2010-11. Vegetables made up 35%, fruit 32%, and tree nuts 4%. Other horticulture, largely made up of nursery products, cut flowers, cultivated turf and specialty crops like oilseed poppy and pyrethrum daisy, accounted for the remaining 24%. Horticulture production in Australia is located around the different climatic zones. As such, each of the many producing regions has its particular window for supplying the fresh market or processors or exports. The bulk of production of fruit, nuts and vegetables occurs in the temperate and subtropical regions, but the tropical and grassland regions are also important producers. The so-called grassland producing regions include most of the irrigated regions on the lower Murray River and, perhaps less importantly, the Gascoyne region of Western Australia. The Australian horticulture industry is domestically oriented. Compared to most other Australian agricultural industries, exports make up a relatively small proportion of total production. And also, unlike most Australian agricultural industries, the fruit, nut and vegetable industries in Australia face strong and growing competition from imports. And this is particularly the case with processed products because of Australia's relatively high labour costs make it difficult for its processing sector to compete on prices with products from countries like Brazil, China, Chile, Thailand, New Zealand, the list goes on. However, Australian imports of fresh fruit and vegetables are limited by Australia's quarantine arrangements aimed at stopping disease incursions. The Australian import market for fresh fruit and vegetables is dominated by the United States and increasingly by New Zealand. Employment on fruit and vegetable farms in Australia has been declining over the last 2 years, at the same time that the gross value of their production has been growing, and this suggests that there's improvements in labour productivity. But employment in fruit and vegetable processing has also been declining, but this mostly reflects the declining competitiveness of this industry as the Australian dollar appreciated through the 2000s. It's really important that Australian horticulture is a growth industry. Over the last 20 years to 2010-11, the gross value of Australian vegetable production increased at an annual average of 2.6% a year, while the gross value of fruit and nut production, excluding wine grapes, increased at 2.2%. These growth rates are very much higher than the average annual growth rate of 0.6% for the rest of Australian agriculture. Having established that sort of background, I'll now turn to the outlook for the Australian horticulture to 2016-17. A strong recovery in Australian horticulture production is occurring in 2011-12, aided by a return to more normal seasonal conditions in most regions and high levels of irrigation water, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, that typically accounts for about 1/3 of the gross value of Australian horticulture production. However, the high production is also causing a decline in prices of most types of fruit and vegetables in 2011-12 compared to the relatively high prices of 10-11, as illustrated with this slide, which shows forecast prices for selected vegetables. Growth in the Australian horticulture industry will be supported over at least the next few years by abundant supplies of irrigation water in the key producing regions. Water storage in the Murray-Darling Basin was at 83% of total capacity in early March 2012, compared with an average of only 37% over the 10 years to 2011. And there's a heck of a lot of water moving through that system that will eventually move into storages. The gross value of Australia's diverse horticulture industry is projected to increase to $10.2 billion in 2011-12 dollars by 2016-17, compared with a forecast $9.3 billion in 2011-12. The key drivers of this growth are, firstly, population, and income growth in Australia. Secondly, increased production from a range of emerging fruit and tree nut industries in Australia. And thirdly, growth in global demand for fruit and vegetables driven by continuing strong income growth, particularly in China. Of the emerging horticulture industries in Australia, the tree nut industry has the strongest growth prospects, particularly the almond and walnut industries. And this is based on the maturing of trees planted in the 2000s. There is also a number of Australian fruit industries with strong growth prospects, mainly the avocado, olive, mango industries, and I'd also throw in berries like blueberries. The growth in the value of Australian horticulture is projected to occur despite a less than favourable outlook for export and import competing sectors in the Australian horticulture industry. You can see from this diagram that the pattern of the value of Australia's net trade in fruit and vegetables, which is defined as exports less imports, is closely related to movements in the Australian exchange rate, especially against the US dollar. During the 2000s, the value of net trade in fruit and vegetables fell partly as a result of the appreciation of the Australian dollar, but also the extended drought over that period was a factor in limiting export availabilities, especially in the Murray-Darling Basin. With the presently high value of the Australian dollar against major international currencies, Australia's net surplus of fresh fruit and vegetables, which is the red bar on that diagram, is forecast to reach record lows in 2011-12, while the trade deficit for processed fruit and vegetables, the blue bars, is forecast to reach a record high. The surpluses for fresh fruit and vegetables are, however, projected to recover a little bit in real terms through to 2016-17, and this is supported by higher production, and it also reflects the assumption of a steady but modest depreciation of the Australian dollar over that period. However, the deficit for processed horticultural products is projected to continue, reflecting the effect of relatively high labour costs in Australia compared with other key exporting countries. It's expected that strong global demand for horticultural products will moderate some of the pressure on the trade-exposed parts of the Australian horticulture industry. World trade in fruit, nuts and vegetables has experienced particularly strong growth since 2000. The increase is particularly significant for fresh fruit, nuts and vegetables, which have grown at annual averages of nearly 9% and 7% respectively since 2000. And you can see from this diagram how the value of world exports of all categories dipped in 2009 due to the global financial crisis. And that really does highlight the importance of income growth as a driver of world demand for these products. But it's also obvious that there are some potential challenges for Australia's horticultural industries over the medium term. The first set of challenges is related to the resources boom in Australia that is causing a strong Australian dollar and strong demand for labour. I showed earlier how the strong Australian dollar reduces the competitiveness of Australian exports and encourages imports, but a strong Australian dollar also increases the incentive for countries to go through the rigorous requirement of meeting Australia's strict quarantine requirements in regard to fresh fruit and vegetable imports. Because of Australia's resources boom, getting skilled farm labour and fruit and vegetable pickers is more difficult and costly. And this is a problem that's being experienced throughout Australian agriculture and indeed in the rest of the Australian economy. There are some government industry initiatives around aimed at easing this problem for the Australian horticulture industry, including the Pacific Seasonal Workers Scheme and the web-based labour information service called Harvest Trail that seeks to acquaint backpackers and travellers and employment seekers with work opportunities around Australia. I've also listed maintaining market outlets as a challenge for this industry. A range of market alternatives for fruit and vegetable growers is necessary for healthy competition in the Australian market. The other speakers in this session will be talking about the prospects for the various market alternatives. The last part of my presentation is about the robustness of the financial state of Australian fruit and vegetable farms, and hence the ability of fruit and vegetable growers to weather the challenges that they're going to face over the medium term. Of the horticulture industries in Australia, of the horticulture industries in Australia, ABARE only comprehensively surveys the Australian vegetable industry. Some information is also available for fruit and nut industries from ABARE's survey of irrigated agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin. For vegetable farms in 2009-10, the average farm income, which is defined as farm receipts less farm costs, was an estimated $142,000 a farm. But an estimated 17% of vegetable farms had negative farm cash incomes in 2009-10. The rate of return on farm capital, excluding capital appreciation in 2009-10 of the average Australian vegetable farm, was an estimated 2.8%. And this compares favourably with the rates of return for broadacre agriculture in Australia of around 0.5% in 2009-10. And that's not a bad result for a year in which 36% of Australian vegetable farmers reported themselves as experiencing drought or below average seasonal conditions. Debt levels of Australian vegetable farms are also reasonably healthy. The average equity ratio of vegetable farms in 2009-10 was 84%. And only an estimated 5% of vegetable farmers had a combination of an equity ratio of less than 70% and negative farm cash income. So the overall impression to me anyway, from the results of ABARE's survey of vegetable farms, is of an industry that is reasonably comfortable in financial terms, though some smaller farms face difficulties. The results from ABARE's surveys of irrigated agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin are a little bit more equivocal. The rate of return on capital, excluding capital appreciation again, in the horticulture industry in the basin is forecast to be negative in 2010-11. The poor overall outcome partially reflects production loss due to extensive floods in key producing regions of the basin in 2010-11 and poor citrus, stone and pome fruit harvests. Improved seasonal conditions in 2011-12, higher allocations and rapidly increasing production in emerging industries such as the almond industry should see an improvement in farm cash incomes and rates of return for horticulture in the basin in 2011-12 and I think for at least a couple of years beyond. So in conclusion, the Australian horticulture industry obviously faces a number of challenges over the medium term. The main challenge arises from the resources boom in Australia that is causing a strong Australian dollar and high labour costs, thus dampening the prospects for the parts of Australian horticulture industry that are trade exposed. Despite this, the Australian horticulture industry is projected to remain a growth industry over the period to 2016-17, driven largely by population and income growth in Australia, increased production from a range of emerging industries in Australia, and last but not least, strong global demand for horticulture products. Thanks very much for your attention.